All right. Welcome all to the Grit City Think and Drink re-up. So happy to be back with the Think and Drink after a short hiatus during the summer. And we have a lineup that is set for the next year. So we're looking for a few more speakers for 2023, but our speakers for the next 6 months are lined up. I'm very happy to have Katie Baird here to kick this thing off for us in October, and we'll introduce her in just a second. Just wanted to, for those of you who have not been to the Think and Drink before, this is a public talk series sponsored by the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW Tacoma. And we are hoping to get back in person come 2023. We just have to find a new in-person venue since our previous venue is no longer there, unfortunately, after COVID. So we're hoping to do that sometime soon. So if you have ideas or connections, definitely email me at jimgal@uw.edu and let me know about any ideas in Tacoma for where we might host this. I've been trying a couple spots and hopefully those will pan out. This happens the second Tuesday of every month. So our next talk is November 8th. Robin Codner from Western Washington is going to talk about pink snow. If you've ever been up in the Alpine during the summertime, you'll see how snow sometimes turns pink, and she's going to tell all about the research that's going on there. Should be a great talk. We have December planned out, talking about how people use lakes and social media ways to collect data on how people use natural resources. So it should be a good span to end out the year. We're going to have introduce our speaker. She's going to give a great talk. Then we will give away some prizes. We have some of our awesome Think and Drink. Ooh, they're kind of translucent though. Our Think and Drink swag here to give away. And then we will have a question and answer session at the end. If you have anything that comes up, technology or otherwise, you can chat to me. And we try to keep everybody's things off just so it doesn't use as much bandwidth. We don't have any Zoom bobbing episodes like we had once in 2021. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker today. Katie Baird is a professor of economics at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and I believe she has been there just about as long as I have, or pretty darn close. She specializes in public economics. Her memoir, Growing Mangoes in the Desert, was published by Apprentice House Press this year. And Katie lives in Tacoma with her husband, Dave, and dog Kia. So Katie, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. And thank you for organizing this event as well as all of the events. So I'm really happy to kick off this one. I hope everybody has a drink. And if you're a baseball fan like I am, I hope you have a really big drink. I almost had to cancel after today's game. But at any rate, thank you all for coming. It's good to see so many of my colleagues and friends. As Jim mentioned, I did just publish a memoir based on my time in the Peace Corps in the village of Siva, Mauritania in the 1980s. And that covers my time there as well as the decades since. I've followed events in the village as closely as I can. I've gone back a couple of times. And one of the purposes of writing that memoir was to introduce the public to a little known part of the world where I was, and also put a human face on the harsh reality that residents in the region confronted on a daily basis and continue to confront. And so today, with that in mind, what I
Does anybody else have Katie frozen right now? Is that just me?
I did when I was in the village and kind of the aftermath of that. Can people hear me?
You're back on now. I think we were having a glitch where you were kind of froze for a while.
Okay, yeah, the PowerPoint just suddenly came on.
Okay.
Yeah, so I hope that what I hope that this does is underscore the challenges of economic development in this part of the world. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn to my PowerPoint, which hopefully you all can see it now. You see the village of Sive, Mauritania there. But I'm going to start from a broader perspective about the geographical region that Sive is in, which is in a part of Africa called the African Sahel. It's the region, this pink band in the slide, that's sandwiched between the Sahara Desert and the African savanna. The Sahel has a number of distinct characteristics, one of which is that in the Sahel you get just enough rainfall that you can have you can grow crops, and therefore you can have settled populations, albeit very sparsely populated and fairly isolated communities that can grow crops. And so it's a pretty harsh environment, not just little rainfall, but also very hot. Gets to about 120 degrees in the hot season, and even the cool season is like 80 and 90 degrees. So it's a tough place to live, and it's not just subject to environmental difficulties, but also historically a lot of political upheaval. And this has to do partly with the environment, where it's not a very resource-rich place, and so under hard times, when there's famine, doesn't take much for a famine to occur. The rains fall a little short, you find people don't have enough to eat. So there's a lot of political instability as tribes seek to raid or conquer other regions. This is also facilitated by the geography. It's a flat landscape. There's not a lot of natural borders or natural barriers to invasions and raiding. There's very little in the way of rivers or mountains or forests that would otherwise impede people from rapidly conquering different areas. Because of the kind of the environmental fragility and the political instability, it's a region where there's been a lot of migration. So kind of social, it's often socially influxive. Groups have moved from one region from the other, have moved from the north to the south in seek of better pasture land or agricultural land. It's also been a region of political conflict and turmoil, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a sec. Kind of just wanted to highlight here in the blue, this is the Senegal River Valley. This is where Sive is located, and very shortly we're going to focus on that part of the Sahel. So to continue to kind of illustrate visually the kind of ebb and flow of empires over the centuries, this is a political map of Africa, and if you focus on the West African Sahel region, you see the coming and going of various empires starting in around 500 AD. This map goes to 1500, and so he's starting with the Ghana Empire, replaced by the Mali and Songhai Empire. For 1,000 years, kind of competing empires seeking to dominate. And what's critical about this area in particular of the Sahel is this is where the river valleys are. So in an area of scarce resources, this is where there's at least water to sustain life and crops. In addition to the competing empires you see here, there's also large nation states or empires to the north that have throughout the centuries periodically come south to raid communities in the Sahel, sometimes to conquer them temporarily, but usually to raid, seeking people, food, and animals, and then retreat back up north into the Sahara Desert. A further political map, I'm zooming forward to the later 1800s, another political map. You see the old empires, the Ghana, the Songhai, and the Mali empires no longer part of the scene. You have different empires. And a couple things that I want to point out about this map. Again, this is about 1870 West Africa political map. A couple things. One is the presence of the French that are at the mouth of the Senegal River. They've replaced the Portuguese and have kind of established a toehold, albeit a small one at this stage, soon to be very large. So a couple things well, one thing about the French and the Portuguese is they brought Christianity and some attempts to convert local people. And so that and the spread of Islam brought introduced political conflict to the area, where you had a lot of locals converting to Islam, very few to Christianity, and others that didn't, which led to political ambitions sometimes being combined with religious motivations to convert the population to Islam. And so there is a trend in Islamic-inspired nations emerging, such as Sokoto, the Tukulor Empire, and the Futa Toro, where the village of Sive is in, and we'll return to that shortly. So again, now 50 years later, you have the French who have very rapidly and violently conquered almost all of West Africa. So this map just shows the borders of French West Africa, which were established by about 1920. Okay, now focusing in on that area that I've highlighted, the Futa, or the Futa Toro. The Futa is the homeland, today, is the homeland of a people called Pulars. So the village of Sive, the ethnic group, are called Pulars, and their language is called Pular. This is kind of the geographical location of where Pulars live. And it also was historically a kingdom. In fact, for about 400 or 500 years, there was a kingdom known now as the Futa Toro that was ruled by the elite clan of Pular society. So the royal clan were the leaders for about 500 years. And Pulars remember this. They know that not that long in the past, this was their country in a sense. And in fact, the word Futa in Pular means country. And so there is historical memory of this period when Pulars lived in this country that was not separated by the Senegal River, which today is separated into Mauritania to the north of the Senegal River and Senegal to the south. So the Senegal River is the dark line that runs through the Futa and separates out Mauritania from Senegal. So Pulars have, I don't think it could be overstated, Pulars' deep attachment to and their allegiance to this land called the Futa. It's also another thing to mention about the Futa before moving on, and part of the story here is that in a very resource-spare area, the Sahel, the Futa is quite rich, is quite fertile. And the reason for that is that the Senegal River, which runs through the middle of it, when the rains come once a year, the Senegal River overflows its bed, and it's created very fertile mud flats kind of within the boundary of the Futa. And because of that, residents of the Futa can get 2 crops in an area where sometimes you're lucky to get 1. And so throughout history, the Futa has always been a coveted place and has often been the source of those empires that have been seeking to conquer parts of the Sahel. The Fouta has been sort of a jewel, if you will. Okay, now I'm going to switch to Mauritania, just to introduce the country of Mauritania. This is a map, and I located where Sive is, right on the border with Senegal, along the Senegal River in that region called Fouta. So first of all, there's nothing natural about the country of Mauritania. What's true throughout West Africa is it's an artifact of the French. The French carved up West Africa into jurisdictions. One was Mauritania, named after the Moors, who are the Berber Arabic people of the north of Mauritania, about the top 2/3 of Mauritania in the Sahara Desert, is where historically the Moors have lived as camel herders. And thus the name Mauritania, which is related to the Moors of history. So the bottom, a third of the country of Mauritania consists primarily of ethnic the other thing I wanted to say about Mauritania before moving on is that in 1960, when it gained its independence from France, the French government handed political power over to the Moors, the Arab Berber population. And that's remained true till today. The country is still economic and politically dominated by the Moors. And okay, so now moving to Sive. This is a picture of the village of Sive. And a couple things I want to point out here. One is you can see the isolation of the village. If you look in the distance, landscape, few little trees, not that many trees. You can almost imagine, an army swooping in, and a place like Sive would have a very hard time to protect itself. So political, again, kind of underscoring the political vulnerability. Flood this land right here, and then when the river receded, you could plant it, and you could get a second crop. Okay. So what was my role in Sive? Well, I came to Sive in 1984 with the Peace Corps. The most important thing to know about what I was doing there for purposes of this talk is there had been a long-standing catastrophic drought across the Sahel that dated to about the 1960s. And so here's a map of rainfall in the Sahel. And you can see starting in 1960, a pretty precipitous drop in rainfall, actually catastrophic in the country of Mauritania. Agricultural yields fell in half, and about 3/4 of the animals in the country died. And this is a country where there was something like 10 animals for every one person. So a really catastrophic drought. One of the responses to the droughts that the international community came up with was to create an organization called SONADER. So SONADER is a ministry.
Hey, Katie, you keep freezing periodically. You might try turning off your camera to save yourself a little bandwidth. Oops. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I wonder if it'll help if I turn off my camera.
Yeah, that's what I think we were suggesting. So yeah, try turning off your camera, see if that helps.
Okay, and where did I leave off, Jim?
You were just showing the picture of the village and talking about the rainfall and think about that point.
Oh, gosh, sorry. So this?
I believe so, yes. Or somewhere in there.
Sonadare in response to the drought. Sonadare had one purpose. My job as a Peace Corps worker was to be an extension worker for this organization called Sonadare, which was stands for Ministry of Rural Development. And so the purpose was to people's vulnerability was to failing rains, well, to make people independent of rains by using the water from the river rather than in the skies to grow crops. Output from the land if you're successful, I should say. So villages were, for the most part, quite receptive in Sonadare coming and converting their mud flats into irrigated rice paddies. But there were a lot of challenges and continue to be a lot of challenges with this conversion. For one, rice is very labor intensive. Second, it takes a lot of social coordination. And in fact, you had to create a cooperative, which was a kind of a new way of organizing yourself socially. And so you needed to be cooperative and coordinate with one another in a way that was unusual and new. Could be a source of social conflict, particularly in a place like Bafuta, where you have a very rigid social hierarchy. In addition to these are some pictures. These are people transplanting rice there, and here they are at harvest time. You can see how labor intensive it is. Kind of everybody comes out at harvest time. And in addition to being challenging for being labor intensive, it's also very capital intensive. You see here the motor pumps that are required to get the water from the Senegal River up and over the banks. Very capital intensive. Also takes hybrid seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, diesel, and spare parts, and even people like me. So it's a very capital intensive, again, very different from traditional agriculture, where basically you need a metal hoe, and that's about it to cultivate. It's also very vulnerable to what we now call supply chain issues. So if the motor pump breaks, as it had in this picture, or if Sonadare didn't deliver fertilizer on time, a common occurrence, your yields could drop in half, and sometimes you could lose your crop altogether. So there was a particular new form of vulnerability that was introduced by irrigated rice. It also had a very challenging financing model. This is a picture of me in my front room with the cooperative president on the left and the treasurer in the middle. And what we're doing here is what Sonadare did is it fronted the village all of the resources for their rice campaign. So that means it fronted the fertilizer, the spare parts, the cost of the motor pump, and on and on. A rice campaign for a village might come to $4,000 or $5,000, a momentous sum. So what we're doing in this picture is we're adding up all the expenses, and we are figuring out how to divide them among the 40 or so families that had cultivated that year. Again, another reason why there could be a lot of conflict in growing rice was just this process of splitting up the expenses in a way that was transparent and that people trusted, which was challenging in a society, again, where there's a pretty rigid caste system, as well as widespread illiteracy. The financing model for rice was challenging in one other way, and that's the way that people paid their Sonadare bill. An individual's bill might be $100 or $200. Typically, a common way that people would pay it is to pay it with rice. So Sonadare would come with trucks, and it would pick up rice from the fields as a way of being paid off. And it would take the paddy rice from the fields, and it would take it to urban centers and turn it into processed rice, which would be consumed by urban populations. That's what they ate. They didn't eat the paddy rice, they ate the processed rice. The problem for farmers was that, about maybe a third of their harvest would go off to the regional capitals and be processed in this way. But when it came to their rice running out, which typically would happen in 6, 8, 10 months after the harvest, then they needed to buy rice. And the only thing that they could buy was the processed rice, because there was no more paddy to be found. It had all been processed. And so they're faced with the problem of processed rice being 2 or 3 times the price of paddy rice. So the common problem in poor rural areas of selling low and having to buy high. So with that background, very quickly we'll tell you about some of the things that I did while I was in the village. One thing that we did is kind of look for ways of getting cash into the village. And one of those that the villagers were very keen on was bringing fruit trees to the village. And so on the left, you see mango seedlings that we were able to purchase. And on the right, you see a picture of those trees 10 years ago when I last was in Seabay. In addition to bringing fruit trees, we also were able to turn women into entrepreneurs by teaching them crocheting and tie-dyeing, sewing and embroidery, and even getting them their own motor pump so they could grow vegetables, which is an important cash crop in the region. So those were some of the activities that I was involved with the village. The most consequential project that I was involved in was one that was financed by the Catholic Relief Services, and which they subsequently called Banking on Rice. And the CRS did 2 things. First, they built the village a very large, sturdy warehouse, which you see here on the left, for storing the village's paddy rice. And the second thing that it did was to give the village, the cooperative leaders, a $20,000 loan to buy back paddy rice. So what that allowed the village, the cooperative to do is at the end of the rice season, when people had to pay their Sonadare bill, they could sell their paddy rice basically to themselves with this loan and then store it on site locally. Then 6, 8, 10 months later, when they've run out of rice and they need rice, they can buy their paddy rice back for a very small markup. We figured that this project saved the village $13,000 a year, which, as you can imagine, was a pretty monumental amount. And also explains why CRS was very keen on finding ways of replicating this project elsewhere. Okay, so this is just a really quick overview of some of the projects that I was involved in, attempts to try to improve the lives of Sea-Bay's residents. So a key question is, well, how did they fare? So the drought continued. I left in 1987. The drought continued. Tensions in the country continued to mount. Increasing pressure from the north on the south, which is what happens in times of famine and drought. Populations from the north move south. And there were increasingly loud claims of competing claims against the land. Again, having to do with the historical mixing of land ownership, never really clear to, who owns the land. Well, it depends on what period of history you're talking about. And people have long memories. And the tension finally erupted in 1989 violently. This is an article, 1989, from the front page of the New York Times, where the Moore government engaged in and backed a violent campaign, basically of land confiscation. It also swept out most of the Black Africans from the military, many of them tortured to death in military camps. It also ended up militarily occupying the Futa and killing and evicting tens of thousands of the Futa's residents. This is a report from Human Rights Watch in 1992 about what they call Mauritania's campaign of terror and state-sponsored repression of Black residents. Needless to say, this chaotic, terrifying period that lasted several years in the Futa brought an end to almost all of our projects. The only thing that survived were the mango trees. So unfortunately, the story of Sea-Bay that I'm telling of political instability and violence extends today to, this is a picture meant to illustrate the growing presence across the Futa of police stations like this. So the police and the military sort of set up shop across the Futa in a way that they had not been present before. So unfortunately, the story of political violence and political instability extends to today to all of the Sahel. These are some headlines taken from The Economist over the last year, where terrorist groups are increasingly taking refuge in the Sahel and expanding throughout. And again, another story of death and displacement as hostile groups take control over the Sahel. You might have followed this coup two weeks ago in Burkina Faso, again motivated by the growing insurgency in that country's north and east, and that threatens the entire nation. This is a map of political violence, actually political deaths in the Sahel. The top one of 2014 and the bottom one this year. And you can see the spread of violence across the West African Sahel, and now dominating the politics of all of those countries. It's not just political violence that threatens the region. We also have in an environmentally very vulnerable location, the toll of climate change as temperatures rise, and a place that's increasingly a hostile environment becomes increasingly uninhabitable as temperatures go above 120, and sand and dust in the air increases so that air quality declines. The rains have also become increasingly erratic. In fact, throughout West Africa, this rainy season, this summer, has been record rains. This is a picture of the capital of Chad in the midst of the Sahel, where they've had record rains. And this is a picture of the capital of Mauritania, Nouakchott, located smack in the middle of the Sahara Desert, where they typically get 2 inches of rain. And this is a picture from about 2 months ago. So just winding up, my attempt has been to put the story of Sibe in the last 4 decades into its regional context by underscoring the particular vulnerability of the village over the last decade to political violence and environmental calamities. Kind of the story of the Sahel over the last 1,000 years, really. And that those features of life for the inhabitants make economic development in the area a particular challenge. So hopefully, Jim, all of that came through. I'm not sure where and if I faded out on you. Now you're muted. Jim, you're muted. Jim, you're muted.
I'm muted. Hi, I'm going to stop doing that. Hi, it's not like I've ever done any Zoom meetings before. I want to give a virtual round of applause to Katie, our speaker. And thank you. We did actually hear pretty much all of that, just a couple of breakups, but it was short, so all wonderful. So before we have our question and answers, I would like to take a quick break for our speaker and give away some prizes. So again, we are giving away, for those of you who are not familiar, we give away Think and Drink swag so you can spread the news. Let's see if I can get it to come in without my face. There you go. There are Think and Drink socks, which are quite styling. They're in the more or less the UW colors as well. So if you want to sport these, what I need to do, I'm going to give a couple trivia questions, which are only vaguely and loosely related to Katie's talk. And you have to be the first one to chat in the answer. To get these socks, though, since we are virtual, I need to get an address from you. If you share your address after you win the socks with me, no one else but me and Katie will see that, and I will make sure that you get your pair of socks. I need to know your address, where to send them to, and I need to know what size you wear. That would be the other thing that's important. So get ready to win some socks, but remember, I do need to get your info from you before you leave today so that I can actually get them to you. The first question, actually, it was in a quick slide that Katie showed, but the question is, just to the north of Mauritania is a disputed territory that exists. What is the name of that territory? Chat your answer. Tim Sharks, right off the bat, Western Sahara. That is correct. Nicely done. We might ask Katie if she knows anything about Western Sahara, because I actually don't know much about that territory. So Tim, make sure you send me your info for your pair of socks. And next question. And again, I said these were loosely related to Katie's talk. She said it was 40 years that she was discussing. So I want to know, 40 years ago in 1982, There was a conflict that took center stage in most of the media in the Southern Ocean, not too far from Argentina. What was that? Ben is on it nicely. It's the Falkland Islands. That's right. That happened in 1982. Nice, Ben. And I'm going to give one bonus. We usually only give away 2 pairs of socks, but because it is actually our first Think and Drink talk in a couple months, we're going to give away 3. So you got one more question coming. Also in 1982, there was a science fiction movie that came out that featured an alien on a bicycle. What was that movie? Charles Williams, E.T., way to go. So Charles Williams, Ben, and Tim, you all get your socks. Nicely done. Thank you for playing. And before we get to question and answers, just remember this happens. Our next talk is November 8th. We're going to be hearing about pink snow here in the Pacific Northwest from Robin Codner. So I hope you will join us again. And now, if you have questions for our speaker, if you would be kind enough to chat those, I will pass them along to her. And maybe I'll start off with one for you while people are chatting in, Katie. Given all the different things facing the Sahel, what do you see as a potential hope for that region, especially in Mauritania, where you're talking about?
Well, that's kind of the big question. Honestly, I would say, solar power, wind power, that's a great natural resource that it has. One of the things that really concerns me about the Futa, maybe particularly being sensitive to air quality issues over the last year, a couple times I've looked up, I've wondered, what is air quality there? It's just horrendous. It's dust and dirt in the air. And I particularly noticed that when I went back 10 years ago, how many people had, problems with lungs, hearts that I think are due to that. So, that just that the health aspect as well as the grueling temperature. I don't have a good answer for that, Jim. I wish I did. Maybe somebody does.
Thank you. Grace wants to know, do you think it was a good idea to have people move to growing rice, or should Sonadair have done something else in retrospect?
Wow. Everybody's asking me these questions I can't answer. In theory, rice was a good idea. As I said, there are a lot of, my memoir has chapters and chapters on the difficulties of growing rice. And like I said, the kind of the financial and the social model. I think it was let's just say it was a very hasty transition. The times were desperate. The international community had millions of dollars. It could have just brought food aid in, for which isn't a great idea either. So some communities that have been growing rice have been very successful. And in fact, part of my story is about CIVE has two cooperatives there. I didn't get into that. One of which was actually very successful. The other wasn't. So was it a bad idea? I would say that it was, in retrospect, it wasn't well thought out in terms of the constraints and the problems, as I said, the supply chain problems, which were really terrible. Would they have been better just to leave them to rain-fed and recessional agriculture? Well, that didn't work either. So kind of bad options all around, I would say.
Thank you. Connie wants to know, do you plan to return in the future?
Thank you, Connie, because I can answer that question. Well, actually, I take that back. I can't. I'm on sabbatical right now, and one of my plans was to go back with my husband. But for reasons discussed in this presentation, it's not a safe place. In fact, the embassy is telling you don't come. And I've had some advice from friends in the capital city not to go back at this time. So I have plans to go back. Just right now is not a great time for a Westerner to be back in that part of the country, that part of the world.
Mike wants to know, do former colonial powers take any responsibility for the current situation?
Mike. So have there been any recognition that the colonial powers could have done things differently or better? Probably not. France in particular has had a very active military presence across the Sahel, but for various reasons, some countries have been, Mali in particular, has been kicking them out, which actually has not, addressed the problem of the militant insurgents in the north. It's actually made it worse. But I would say probably on the whole, I think it depends on, kind of what you're talking about. I would say probably not.
Thank you.
Or certainly not.
Charles wants to know, how much did the villagers shape the decisions about the attempted economic transitions?
Charles, are you talking about the things that I did in the village, or are you talking about kind of the conversion to irrigated rice?
Yeah, the shift to crops, to various crops, and just any of the, you were talking about the difficult choices that were not particularly favorable in any direction. I'm just curious to know how much the villagers wanted to commit to any of those things or felt like they were imposed from outside and so on.
So the transition, so what I can say is, in terms of the strategy, the overall strategy to convert to irrigated rice, I sincerely doubt there was much consultation at the, there wasn't a strong regional leadership. You got national leadership, and then you had all the peasants out in the rural area. I would say that for the most part, communities wanted these irrigated perimeters. They had promise. People were desperate. So desperate that in my village, the village chief essentially gave up all of his land. Basically, the village chief kind of, if you will, owned the mud flats. The mud flats are typically owned by the sort of the royal caste, and some in my village hailed from that, and they own the mud flats. And he essentially turned it over to the village. So I mean, that's kind of a monumental decision to be made, but it shows the level of maybe desperation or the willingness or kind of out of options to try something new. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Charles. I think you might be asking something a little bit different.
Thanks, Katie. I suppose I was curious because long ago I have some connection to the world of development studies, and there was a sort of strong push for this idea of participatory development, right? That there's local knowledge, that people in those communities have better understanding of strategies to move forward. You should learn from them, and obviously there's dangers in bringing in pesticides or particular seeds that you can then are sort of obligated to use forever after and all that. So I was just kind of curious what their sense of agency was, or their own vision of what the choices were and so on, that kind of thing. Thanks.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say 0.
Cool, thank you. One last question. Eric wants to know, you mentioned mangoes, and I was actually curious about this too. In Kenya, where I did some work, like mango trees were one that some of them were ancient, and they became sort of the center of some villages. You actually had this giant mango tree, and that was where everybody congregated. So Eric wants to know, do those mango trees still around, and are they a significant economic asset at all for the villagers that live there?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, it's the mango trees are planted about 4 miles outside of the village. So, you know, you have to, they're way out in the mud flats that are about 4 or 5 miles away. And yeah, that has throughout the decades has been an important source of cash income when they ripen once a year. I think in around April or May, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, that has been fairly successful. How much money I couldn't really say.
Nice. One, we just had a last question come in from Ben. He wants to know, he's curious, a lot of discourse about social justice and cultural awareness has changed in the past couple of decades. As someone who has made a number of trips to Mauritania over the last several decades, did you notice a change or a shift in the experience of being a traveler from the US global north? Good question.
Did I notice a change? Are you talking about kind of my own perspective?
Let's see, I'll unmute Ben. Ben, you can clarify. Yep, he might be busy.
Hey, Katie, sorry. What I was just trying to, I'm kind of curious as to, you know, there's been this big change in like study abroad materials and a lot of discussions about what does it mean for young Americans to go into the global South? What kinds of tools do they need to equip themselves to be sort of good citizens abroad, et cetera? And, you know, you've visited over a course of a period where I feel like that discourse has changed a lot. And I'm just curious if you have any reflections from your own experience, having gone at different points in your life, what that was like. Because there's obviously like a lot of, you know, power and hierarchy involved in being able to make these kinds of trips in the first place. And I imagine it's very different in one decade from, you know, the past 10 or 20 years. So I was just curious about that. It's sort of an idle fascination.
Yeah, I guess when I think about my trips back, I was in such a different, you know, situation. My trips back, I really was a tourist as opposed to somebody who had lived there for a couple of years. So, you know, and a different age. The last time I went, I was towing my 17-year-old son with me. So I was also a mom. I mean, it is kind of shocking to me when I think about how little the Peace Corps really prepared us for what we did, basically just kind of sticking us out in these villages where, you know, I knew almost nothing about rice. I barely spoke the language. And so I would imagine and I would hope that the Peace Corps has a different, you know, different approach to training young people. You know, I certainly when I was there, I was completely aware of my privilege. I mean, you couldn't not be aware, just the way people treated you. And I mean, basically my value in the village was being a white person, because what I could do is I could go to the Capitol and I could get CRS to come fund these projects. I could get, you know, government agencies, or sorry, the German government to buy these mango trees. And the village, that was my value, was my white face. And that was sort of pretty explicit, that people would come with me to problems and, you know, and after some collaboration, I'd, you know, go off to the capital city and look for money. So yeah, I'm not really answering your question, Ben. and I'm just trying to think about how I might have, what sorts of reflections I might have. I'm not coming up with anything, worthy of engaging with you on that. Sorry, maybe I'll think about it overnight and
Sounds like a perfect conversation to have over some beers and chat about it in person for sure. That's a heavy duty question for sure. But we are about out of time. I want to thank a great speaker, Katie, so much for being our first speaker in months. Thank you, Katie. It was wonderful to hear about an area of the world I have never been to. So,
Jim, could I just say one more thing before we leave? I just wanted to give a warm welcome to Abdul Bo, who I see has joined us. Abdul is somebody I met in Mauritania about 35 years ago, and he's a resident, or I should say, he's from the Futa, and now lives in Cincinnati. And so, Abdul, I really appreciate you showing up for this.
Welcome, Abdul. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for a wonderful evening. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening and week. And we hope to see you in November for our next talk. Everyone take care. Be well.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Katie.
Jim. Thank you, Jim.
Bye.